To review a little bit from last time, to wrap up, political and what I wanted to convey to you last time is that political and legal attitudes towards property as a mobile commodity, as a mobile commodity developed in the United States after the Revolution. As a mobile property was to be developed to the maximum extent possible for the common good. This was a distinctive approach to property, to real estate, that was for a while peculiar to the United States, though it spread to other countries. And then sometimes, as in the case of when it influenced ideas in Australia in the mid-19th century, Australian ideas boomeranged back to the United States and affected some revisions of property laws at the end of the 19th century. This idea of property as a mobile commodity that should be developed to the maximum extent possible pushed the development of U.S. natural resources to an extraordinary amount. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was producing over 50% of the world's commodities, agricultural commodities, timber, minerals, and petroleum. As a primary resource producer, the United States was extraordinary. It became the world's largest producer in each of these areas during the last 3 decades of the 19th century, producing more at a cheaper cost despite higher wage levels than anybody else. So a California farmer could produce rice more cheaply than a Japanese farmer, and the rice could be sold in Tokyo or Osaka for a cheaper price than any Japanese farmer could possibly sell it for. This then leads, the same thing was happening to the kinds of to corn in Italy, to potatoes in Ireland, to wheat and cereals in Russia. U.S. farmers could produce at a rate that was extraordinary, both in terms of quantity and also in terms of price. U.S. farmer could produce more per acre than farmers in any other countries at that time. Why? First, there was an extensive transportation system, which meant that if you produced it, it could be shipped to somebody. By 1900, in the year 1900, 60% of railroad track in the entire world was within the lower 48 states. Again, this was by government policy. It didn't arrive as a result of the market per se. It resulted because the government wanted to open up land to settlement, and it facilitated the development of a railroad system. Secondly, extensive use of machinery. Farmers could be more productive than their competitors in other countries because they had higher caliber tractors and so forth to work with. This was also fueled by government policy, but primarily through government support for the railroad network, which meant the development of a steel, iron, and metal construction industries, which could then be applied to the development of farm implements. And U.S. farmers, generally having more money than other farmers, could buy more expensive equipment. Not everybody, but there was a push down in prices and a push from below for more and more farmers to get more and more technical equipment. And there was also growing use of scientific and technical knowledge to help increase the yield per acre. And this was a result of universities accepting financial assistance through the Morrill Act of 1863, were required to do research and development in agriculture, in mining, and in other areas, and to assist producers in their states. So U.S. food dominated global markets because it was so much cheaper. Hence, having dominated the global markets, there was a push to increase production, which also stimulated industrial production to sustain this global demand for food. So we can say that the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution in the United States, was subsidiary to the Agricultural Revolution of the post-Civil War period. Without the farmers, you wouldn't have had the demand for heavy industry. And the farmers were there because the government was convinced that in a working man's republic, which is how the United States self-styled itself at the time, every working man, white in parentheses, understood, should be able to get a plot of land and develop his personal independence that way. But in order to get the plot of land, in general, he was going to have to wind up producing for people on the other side of the world. So this whole system allowed and in fact encouraged, and you might even say forced farmers to specialize in crops, specific kind of crops, if they were going to participate in either the national or the international market. So wheat and cattle in the Great Plains, fruit and dairy farming in the east, cotton, tobacco, wheat and rice in the south, grain, fruits, vegetables, cattle, and wheat in the west. California was one of the world's largest agricultural producers in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, and almost all of its produce was sold to England for consumption there or in the various British colonies. So farmers prospered because they were increasingly dependent on others. So be a farmer is to become an independent citizen, but in fact it meant that you're going to become increasingly dependent on others to make your livelihood. Banks and loan companies were there to provide capital to expand operations. There were plenty of middlemen who stored and sold produce. Railroads carried goods to market. British ships carried your goods around the world. You, in fact, the more successful you were, the more dependent you became on others. And you were also not only in competition with other farmers in your region, but increasingly with other farmers in other parts of the country. And by the end of the 19th century, you were increasingly in competition with farmers in every part of the world. If a London merchant could get cotton from Egypt for a fraction of the prevailing U.S. price, American producers had to lower their prices to sell, or they could try to create a shortage by destroying much of their crop. The more long-term and better strategy for them was to lower the cost of production, which meant increased technology, producing more with less, which became, again and again, has been a principal theme in the development of U.S. business. But in practice, the individual farmer could hardly afford to destroy his crop. Lux Miller in California could, but the individual farmer who had to make a living every year hardly could. And it was, for the individual farmer, it was also difficult to be able to buy the next piece of machinery unless you had the market available. So there were pressures leading to the greater incorporation of agriculture. And indeed, global overproduction, as other countries began to imitate U.S. production methods, there's a glut of commodities on the market, and farm prices declined steadily through the last third of the 19th century and into the 20th century. U.S. farmers were indeed well positioned to deal with that decline in agricultural commodities because they had already been operating on the strategy of using machinery and using scientific inputs such as pesticides and fertilizers to increase their production, so lowering their unit cost. They were much of the political turmoil, which we'll get into in the following weeks, was due to this to this conflict between decreasing prices but increasing ability to produce goods, agricultural products at a cheaper rate. Now, what did farmers want? Why were they at the core of social protest in the 1880s and 1890s? What they wanted was greater predictability in the market. They wanted government support to offset fluctuations that could not be controlled. They wanted a government alternative to banks. And they wanted railroads that were regulated by the government, so that railroad profits would be dependent on farmers' profits. This would be, over the next 30, 40 years, a tug of war between benefiting from the growth of a global market and participation in the global market, and yet suffering from the unpredictabilities of a global market and seeking some way to use the government or mechanisms of management to counter these unpredictabilities in the market system. The chief response of the government to these protests was to try to make more land available for people who wanted to become farmers, which did not answer the basic problems that farmers were raising, which had to do with credit and transportation and so forth. And improvement remained the touchstone of everybody's right to own property, which meant only that the single obstacle to the development of the country was the fickleness of national and international markets. So if you could somehow or other learn how to manage the markets, then you would be able to build a sustainable, growing economy. You would have to have a higher, and the only answer to that fickleness was a higher level of organization. And during the post-Civil War years, the modern U.S. corporation developed an elaborate and highly effective set of responses to the challenge of market unpredictability. In the process, the U.S. corporation compensated for the single greatest vulnerability that U.S. capitalists, U.S. businessmen, had in going head-to-head with any of their foreign competitors: the remarkable high cost of labor in the United States, a cost that was high precisely because land was so readily available. So, the U.S. corporation. What I'm trying to counter is an idea that there's something called capitalism or the free market that exists outside of national and historical circumstances. There's specific forms of capitalism that develop in each country at different times. And the form of capitalism that was very successful in the United States was distinct from the capitalisms that were developing in other countries. At the time, and the end of the 19th century, American economists and English economists, American businessmen, English businessmen, American politicians, English politicians were well aware that U.S. capitalism and English capitalism were very different. They had different conceptions of what a market could be, and they had very different conceptions of how you could work a market. Now, since England